that defy any sort of respectability politics or rhetorics of what is considered to be quote unquote good sex by offering avenues to explore one's fantasies. And I think fantasies becomes a really important and critical point when we are discussing pornography. In yesterday's panel, for instance, Indu's anecdote I thought was just extremely amazing. When she was speaking of an incident that happened in Vienna, where white men were lining up for her and describing her as exotic and beautiful. Now, one may respond to such a narrative or such a situation or such an occurrence by bringing down the guillotine of political correctness and questioning, how could a white man desire me as an exotic object? How could I end up desiring a white man who desires me as an exotic object? But Indu does something a little different, something that's off center. She takes her desires seriously and realizes that she wanted to stay without ever fully understanding why, when she says, quote, whatever it was that made me stay. Indu, of course, is not alone in this. At the risk of making a gross generalization, I think we all have had fantasies that run in complete opposition to who we think we are. For instance, ContraPoints, a YouTube channel where Natalie Wynn makes essay format videos on a variety of issues, discusses how women feel needless guilt over fantasies of being dominated by men in bed. That guilt, of course, transpires out of the abrasive collision of one's desire to be dominated by men and one's desire to be a feminist, which treats any sort of power equation where men are being upheld or put in a pedestal and is very skeptical of it. This is all to say, to not make a moralistic judgment on what is a good fantasy or a bad fantasy, but to point to the fact that fantasies really mount a ton of pressure on our own confidence in who we think we are. And in doing so, it releases us into a space of utter confusion and instability. Paramita, for instance, in yesterday's panel, quite brilliantly drew our attention to the importance of confusion and the risk of labeling something as quote unquote normal. Porn then, vis-a-vis fantasies, could push us all into spaces of confusion where we could be utterly kinky. I'm not using the word kinky only to denote sexual kinkiness, but also I'm thinking of it mathematically. So a kink in mathematics is, if this is a graph, x-axis, y-axis, a kink is something that interrupts it. So to visualize it, a heartbeat, the jaggedness in the middle, that would be a kink. So porn could allow us to interrupt this straight narrative. And by that, I don't mean a heterosexual narrative, but a narrative that imagines us to be coherent people. Porn can really put pressure on that sort of assumed coherencies and can also then nudge us to think whether we know ourselves ever. And if we could ever know ourselves fully, and that our desires are anything but transparent, either to other people or to even ourselves. This sort of realization, acknowledgement, pushes us into a space that is unstable, that is interruptive, that is disruptive. And to go back to one of Parumita's words, it helps us put pressure on normativity itself, because it helps us realize that our conception of self always has gaps, and desire can always flit through those gaps and reveal them to us. To tie all of this together, yes, porn can play a role in education. It should play a role in education. And that role perhaps would be to offer ourselves the space to acknowledge our own incoherencies, messiness, impurities, violence, and the fantasy of a consolidated good self.
Thank you so much. I think a lot of what I will be saying also will sort of complement what Shreyanshu has already talked about. But I think I'd like to begin by talking about just porn before we move into the education aspect of it, especially because There's been a long history of discourse around porn, feminism, sexual liberation. But to talk about porn means to address obscenity first, right? Especially in the Indian subcontinent, where almost all of the porn sites are only available as proxy sites. They're illegal. And some web pages, especially in educational institutions, even these proxy sites are banned. And I think that's why it's important that we sort of address obscenity first. And Charul, if you could share the slide. So the Indian Penal Code, IPC 292, defines obscenity as, wait for Charul to sort of put it up so you can also read it with me. Thank you so much. A book, pamphlet, paper, writing, drawing, painting, representation, figure, or any other object shall be deemed to be obscene if it is lascivious, what a word, or appeals to the prurient interest or if its effect, or the effect of any of its items is, if taken as a whole, such as tend to deprave and corrupt a person who are likely having regard to all relevant circumstances to read, hear, or the matter contained or embodied in it, right? It's written in a very convoluted fashion, but the gist is that any material is deemed obscene if it is lascivious, my new favorite word, and tends to corrupt and deprave a person, right? And like any law in the Constitution, I think this too has its own exceptions, which is probably in the next slide, Charul. Thank you. Which says, you can read it, but basically the first point is that it must be for the public good, what it calls the public good, the general concern, general good of people. And secondly, as long as it's a part of the religious history, and looking at the choice of words that's given here, temples, idols, it is a very deeply Hindu history, right? So there's already a distinction that the law makes between pornography and education. That pornography sort of deprives and depraves, whereas education in a way endows and supplies, right? So the function of pornography is to arouse instincts, even the deepest fantasies that one might try to resist, which, as the law lays out, to be antithetical to the conventional idea of education, which brings a certain kind of dignity, composure, sophistication, and a kind of respectability, right? And that's how the distinction is made. Once it is, and as you can see, once it is for the utilitarian purpose of learning, it's no longer even called pornography. It's called art, it's literature, it's science, and it's biology, right? So the obscenity law, of course, doesn't just apply to books and texts, but that are perverse, but also, of course, extends to the film certification board that deems a film worthy of viewer consumption, and to quote, I think, to reduce crimes due to violent depiction, right? So the reasoning that the censor board provides time and again for disproving sexually explicit content is that doing so will in a way curb sexual violence, right? Now, I think this is a very important proposition because the stance is not just unique to the law and is not just sort of propagated by the state alone. And I find it extremely interesting when the conservative government and feminist movement sort of exhibit similarities in that approach, right? So the anti-porn movement, which was a part of it's a radical feminist group, which is part of the late 1970s and 1980s, which of course isn't unique to that time period because we see traces of that argument present even in current feminist imagination of what counts as sexual and feminist liberation, right? And maybe Charul, if you could go to the next slide. It sort of gained momentum by writers such as Andrea Dworkin, Susan Brown Miller, and others. And there are two quotes here, and these are Dworkin's popular phrases. The first is, any violation of a woman's body can become sex for men. That is the essential truth of pornography. And an even more striking one is the second one, which says pornography is the theory, rape is the practice, right? And maybe in the next slide, you can see that this article on Washington Post also takes a similar position, right, on the left, which says, without porn, the world would be a better place. Being an anti-porn feminist isn't to advocate censorship, but to highlight the fact that pornography contributes to misogyny. Now, the striking similarity between both of these discourses, that's the state's obscenity laws and the feminist movement, is that neither makes any kind of distinction between institutionalized forms of violence and representations of that violence, right? They assume a certain kind of likeness, a very simplistic cause and effect, if you will, between abusive sexual practices and their representation in pornographic fantasy. So modern day feminist anti-pornographic stances simply, in a way, reiterate the history of censorship. And this narrative inevitably paints the notion that sort of acts of sex, in acts of sex, women are nothing but victims of phallic aggression and power. And I think the previous slide, Sharon, if you could. Yeah, and in the other article that I put up, this is a more recent one. It's from Feminism in India, where it says why your feminism should be critical of porn. And I find the title itself very interesting because it already makes that kind of distinction, right? Your feminism, which is supposedly different from my kind of feminism. Again, now you can go to the next slide, where I want to read out just a passage from it, where it says that it is important to note that pornography is a consequence of patriarchy and not the sexual liberation of women. It is hence imperative that any conversation about the harms of pornography focus on the misogyny and the abuse it promotes, rather than an imagined sexual freedom of women, especially since true sexual liberation will compel us to reimagine the existence of sexual ties outside of misogyny. True sexual liberation will not teach 14-year-old girls that they must want violent sex to be desirable to men. True sexual liberation will not produce a male fantasy version of sex that borrows heavily from the patriarchal themes of subjugation and dominance. And I want to pay some close attention to the choice of words here, like the true literature major that I am. Because this does sound like powerful rhetoric on the face of it, right? It talks about hardcore pornography and the potential harms of it, and then it eventually goes on to lay out what the truth or the essence of sexual liberation is, right? And it takes for granted the very obviousness of pornography, which, like sex, must either be liberated or repressed, must be good or bad, must be pleasurable or abused, right? And this kind of narrative also sort of fits certain kinds of sexualities or certain modes of sexual difference as the source of our problems, and sexual liberation therefore becomes the solution to the problem of sexual violence, right? And I think that this essentialization, this sort of saying that it's a self-evident truth of sex, the author also lays out a kind of desire that is fully devoid of violence. And to go back to her phrase, where she says, rather than an imagined sexual freedom, which is as if to say that liberation cannot exist in the realm of imagination and fantasy alone. Right? And the article also suggests that all kinds of aggression is in fantasy is a male fantasy, which is a very deeply heterosexual narrative as well, if we think about it. And what it also implies is that normal sexuality, or in a way, a clean kind of sexuality, is never violent, not even in the imagination. And I think that this attack on violence and this rhetoric of harm not only asserts a kind of sexual norm that must be followed, but does it in the guise of protecting pornography's victims. And even with the intention to liberate, we simply take on the role of sort of heroes who are ultimately saving the suffering woman, right? And it is from here that I want to shift focus to perhaps the sphere of education and how modern day wokeness, supposedly radical political thought, vouches for safe spaces in education. And this is simply employed by rejecting certain ideas, thoughts, texts that are uncomfortable and violent, right? And I think it's simply because of this that I won't answer the question of whether porn can play a role in education, because it's easy to find solutions that seem like a fix, right? If porn is banned, then that's the ultimate end to sexual violence. If porn is taught in the correct way, people will deal with their sexuality in a not very messy way, and therefore, again, reducing violence, right? I'm instead interested in what Susan Sontag, the writer, who calls it the pornographic imagination, right? And I think this imagination, this fantasy, is essential to education. And I think part of the reason why porn is also unsettling is because, which we don't really want to address yet, but because in porn, everyone can have sex with anyone. And I think that is the most dangerous threat to order, to sexuality, to institutional forms of education, right? And I'm reminded of what Shohini Ghosh's article, where she talks about the concept of Savita Babi in the Indian context, which is a fictional fantasy where of a married woman who's sort of having sex with anyone she likes, a working class man, husband's colleague, salesperson, and the readers of this fiction are rooting for them to not get caught. And there is a pleasure in this kind of secrecy, in this kind of danger. And that is also where I want to reiterate, which Vikram already brought up in yesterday's session, and Shreyanshu also reminded us of, that censorship or ban also works against itself, right? In this kind of prohibition, in a way, fuels desire. So this example of Savita Babi becomes interesting and is essential to sort of trouble forms of monogamy. And once again, in the South Asian context, to think of sex outside of marriage, outside of procreation. And I think even the pedagogy of sex education as we see it these days, or even just simply education, shouldn't constantly sort of vouch for safety, right? Safe sex, safe space, because the very etymology of the word porn, which is very interesting again, comes from a Greek root called porneia, which means prostitution, males and females alike, referring to a certain kind of sexual and moral deviance, right? A certain sense of danger, which again is antithetical to notions of safety. But I think that any mode of education, like sex, must be and is inseparable from notions of danger, because knowledge, I think, is fundamentally dangerous. And perhaps that's what's needed, especially in a very right-wing dominated country where censorship is constantly employed to suppress deviance, right? So I think that is why pornographic imagination or the dangers of fantasy are essential to education. And I'm sorry, I might have gone over time, so I'll stop here. But
Thank you so much, Rita. I think it's time for Karishma to take.
Thank you so much, Shreyanshu and Shrija, like making me reflect a lot on a lot of methods and tools that I've used a lot as a sexuality educator. And I think I'm going to come at this from a point of view which is very different. I do not have supporting definitions, texts, and quotes from scholars, but I do have like lived experience of just like speaking with a bunch of high school students, speaking with a lot of young people. And a lot of that comes from, and I'm going to like set the stage a little bit with just sharing my background, because a lot of what I'm going to say is informed by the people I've talked to. And so I started teaching sex ed when I was in college. I was a college student teaching sex ed to high school students. I use the word teaching, but we used to say it was facilitation. We are not teachers. We are trying to get people to reflect and think about and muse upon. And the college I went to, also Brown University, very liberal, and students like wrote these curricula ourselves, but they were at the end of the day vetted by Planned Parenthood, and we were very much proclaiming what safer sex is and shouldn't be. And so that's very much where I started, and then have also worked in India with schools, but Indian schools didn't allow us to do the same types of interventions that I've done in the US. So in the US, I was doing things like seeing the same group of students every week for an entire semester. So when Shreyanshu defined sex education as something that's a subset of biology, it like hurt my soul a little bit, because definitionally speaking, and I pulled this up because I didn't have any pretty slides, but comprehensive sexuality education is supposed to be something a little more holistic. In practice, like don't start reading, please, this is just there for your reference. But in practice, the way that we grew up in school, sex was really only talked about in the context of biology. Though sex was only talked about in the context of menstrual health education. But in the context in which once you start thinking about it with some of these like more holistic tools and thinking about knowledge, attitudes, and skills, I think there is definitely some of the moralistic arguments that Shreyanshu and Shrija have mentioned. But I think it's also like trying to encourage people to think about sex from a point of view of rights and bodily autonomy. And when I taught an 8-week curriculum about sex ed, we would start with like, here's your body, how does it work? Here's how to put on a condom. Here's how contraception works, STIs work. But then you really dig into how is sex represented in the media, and getting to talk to 15, 16-year-olds about how sex is represented in the media, you realize that if porn is the only place you've ever seen sex, if porn is the only place you've ever heard about sex or engaged with sex or even like referenced in conversations with friends about sex, there's very little to compare to. There's very little to compare to. And I think back to myself as a curious 14-year-old who didn't know what the word sex meant. I Googled it. I Googled it just the way I Google everything else I find. And naturally, like, I found things I probably shouldn't have seen at age 14. And at age 14, and like, I'm throwing around the age 14, but if you Google it, there's like a lot of anti-porn feminists, particularly, will say age 11. There's this like widely cited number of age 11 as being the average age a young person first encounters pornography. I tried to get to the root of where that number comes from. It was kind of questionable. So I did an Instagram poll because Instagram is really where I interface with the world the most. And my Instagram poll showed me 109 people answered, 80% had watched porn before the age of 18, and the average age was age 14. At age 14, very few schools are talking to young people about sex. Maybe there's been a menstrual health conversation if there are people with vaginas present, probably separated from people with penises, right? And I think keeping that framing and context in mind is really important, because I want to share some things that shock young people when I mention porn, when I say that, oh, actually porn is not exactly real. Because no one has ever said that to them, right? Like when you watch a movie, when you watch a TV show, for example, if you've watched a bunch of American TV shows, you probably think life in America looks like sitting in Central Park, whatever the Friends cafe was, right? That's not what life in America looks like for the average American, particularly if you're not a rich white person in New York City. And I think similarly, like, I'm just going to name a few of these things because these are ways in which porn falls short. And I say this not to say that porn is like blanket wrong and should not be like ever used or something like that, but just to say that mainstream pornography is perpetuating Shah Rukh Khan jumping off a building and landing on his feet. That is not real life. That's not going to happen if someone does that in real life, right? And similarly, I think people are surprised when they go like, actually in pornography, no one ever wears a condom. I don't understand why this person is going on about wearing a condom, because literally they do it all the time. All these performers are having sex with so many people, they don't have to ever wear a condom. And then I'm like, hey, actually, someone did a study in LA and 25% of porn performers have had some type of STI in their lives, right? Which is not to say an STI is the end of the world, but I think it's an important thing to remember, as like, there are things happening off screen, there's testing happening off screen, there are conversations happening around consent, around negotiating contracts and boundaries, which are not happening on screen, which to us, to you and me, like as an adult, maybe we've thought about it, maybe we know, logically speaking, an actor has signed a contract. But as a young person who is like afraid to discuss this with anyone else, let alone an adult, that becomes truth. That becomes true, because that is the power of visual media, right? Like, you're watching a movie, you're likely to believe that a certain place looks that way because it is so compelling. It is a really compelling narrative to look at. And so it's not just the STIs and the contraception, right? It's also like the bodies. The bodies we look at are thin, are able-bodied, are a lot of white people. When there are non-white people, they're fetishized, right? And I feel kind of silly saying this after Shreyanshu's point, but it's to the point that like the title will mention the race of the person. And like, I want you to think back to when you were 12 years old. When I was 12 years old, no one was having conversations with me about race. No one was having conversations with me about the politics of what it means to hold identities, which is not to say 12-year-olds today are not thinking about those things. I think there's a lot more that 12-year-olds today, especially with like TikTok culture, with all the young people having more of a platform, having more of a voice, I think are becoming more and more aware. But there's things like also just seeing the size of a penis. the size of the penis, seeing how long sex goes on for. People are shocked. Young people are shocked when I say that actually you're not supposed to have penis and vagina. I'm not supposed to, but like the average person does not have penis and vagina intercourse for 25, 30 minutes, 1 hour. And that the average time, according to like certain scientific research, is 6 minutes before a penis ejaculates, right? Like, similarly, like you never see an intersex body. You never see diversity of vulvas. You never see people's genitals that are darker in color. People are confused when they have a foreskin, and all the pornography they've watched has never shown people with penises having foreskins, right? They're like, is something wrong with me? Is that going to affect how much pleasure I can experience? And I think similarly, this point around representation, I think, becomes an important one, because when you've never seen, and not just genitalia, right? Like when you've never seen people of different races having relationships where they're just like meeting as equals and not as the fetishized body. I think that especially and I think there's a lens to look at this from where we grew up in a fairly, like, I say this with caution, but like a fairly homogenous space, right? Like a lot of our spaces are homogenous. If you are in a certain school, if you are in a certain class strata, like the average child is not being forced. And I say average, I mean like upper middle class child with access to the internet is not being confronted with these realities on a day-to-day basis. And then of course there's just this point of consent, and again, like I think that's such a complicated conversation to be like, there are no scripts around what sex is supposed to look like. We watch it on TV, we watch it in movies, we see relationship dynamics play out, but in pornography, in a space which is, and I keep saying pornography, but I mean mainstream pornography, a space which is stripped of any type of negotiation, any type of boundary setting, any type of this is what I'm comfortable with, or actually I'm not feeling this anymore. I want to pause. I want to take a break from this. What happens is young people try and emulate what they see in pornography. Amia Srinivasan says it very well. She's like, pornography doesn't persuade, it trains. It trains. It is the thing we watch and try to imitate because we have nothing else to think about. And if all these points shock young people, I think it's because like, it just speaks to the power that pornography has to capture our imaginations. Pornography holds a power which is above and beyond. And I think like a lot of social spaces have started, and a lot of social spaces have started using narrativizing social change as like a way to create behavioral change, right? Like make movies, make media which normalizes gay people, make movies, make media that show like condom usage, things like that. And I think there is an untapped potential that pornography has. And some of these mainstream sites like Pornhub and like a lot of ethical pornography creators like Erica Lust are trying to subvert some of these mainstream narratives, trying to show pornography with more real bodies, in quotes real, trying to show people having these conversations, setting boundaries, all of that stuff. And I have to just say, like, I see a lot of potential of pornography to create that change that we're looking for, to create the change that we're seeking, precisely because it is truth. It is truth. If I Google sex, that is what I find. And I wish sex education was as easily accessible to young people, but it is not. It is not. When I Google, I'm more likely to find pornography than a sex education, in quotes, answer. And the thing that is really, really hard with all of this is that I can say that, okay, sex education for a 12-year-old, for a 14-year-old, in a school context, in a parental context, should be including pornography, should have kink positive conversations, all of this stuff. But then I think back to schools that I've visited, teachers that I've spoken to, and teachers that I've spoken to who are shocked when I say, hey, actually, we need to be saying pleasure is a thing. You know, they're like, how do we talk to 12-year-olds about pleasure? And I'm like, listen, if we don't say pleasure is a thing, children are going to think like, why the heck is there like this shiny gift wrapped present in the middle of the room, but we're told don't open it. Like we're watching it on TV, we're watching it in movies, we're watching it on pornography, but in the classroom, sex is only for reproduction, or and that's it. And only between cisgender heterosexual people who are trying to reproduce. And I think that when I spoke to teachers, what shocked me was also like, it was a Zoom class. Everyone turned off their cameras. It was embarrassing. It was, I think it's one thing to have this conversation in theory and say, we need to allow for errors and things like that. But what do you do when the average teacher has also not grown up in a feminist context? When the average teacher has themselves never had sex education talk? And I know I'm running out of time. So I'm going to leave us with one last thought, which is, okay, it escaped me. I saw Charles nod about running out of time, and I'll bring it up later if it comes back to me. But the point being that when we think about what education looks like, oh yeah, it's come back, sorry, 30 more seconds. It is also something that is lifelong. And as we're thinking about who owns education, and as we go through this conversation, I want to place into this space that like, there is, let's think about it from the framework of what does sex ed mean for someone who's 12, 14, 18, and 25, 35. And like you and me, young people who are trying to understand sex still, trying to understand what these relationship dynamics are, what a healthy relationship looks like, how to construct and speak about our desires. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
So much, three of you. Those were some really powerful comments. And this sort of makes me think of this sort of a crack between when we are thinking about debates around porn. And maybe one which I think we started with and also we have come in full circle with is one of fantasy and the other one of biology. And if there is that crack, if there is that crevice, is there any usefulness to that? So anyone can go first, and yeah. Yes, Shrija, I think you look interested.
Anshu just unmuted, so I'm going to wait for him to speak and then go next. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Shrija. So when you speak of like a crack between biology and fantasy, and what does that crack do? Well, I think first and foremost, it puts pressure on any sort of empirically verifiable data that biology purports to have, or sort of any sciences tries to negotiate with. A lot of conversations in sex ed, at least when I was in school, always hinged around the idea of biology, and desire or pleasure, as both Shrija and Karishma mentioned, were never in the picture. So attraction was always also coded in terms of biological factors. So pheromones and stuff like that, which I just find completely reductive. I do not think that I'm attracted to another person on the basis of what pheromones their bodies emitting. Maybe that could be a part of it, maybe not. But I'm for certain that it's not the deciding factor. So that crack between biology and fantasy puts pressure on biology and the realness that it tries to concretize itself in.
Yeah, and just to sort of follow that, I think this kind of crack that you mentioned also exhibits the flaws in each of these categories by themselves, right? Because the idea of realness kept coming up, even through sort of Karishma's talk, and even I mentioned what it means to be real, unreal truth of it. And I think what this sort of conventional education on sex ed, like Shanshu mentioned, while it presents a certain kind of technical language to desire, to the messiness of sex, it's also sort of maybe not where we want to go when we talk about fantasy also, that, okay, this is in the imagination, this is in fantasy, but when we come to real life, that kind of messiness doesn't quite hold its place, right? In real life, sex is different, but in the fantasy, it's sort of portrayed like this. But having said that, I think even when, and that's why I'm wary of sort of turning this kind of narrative into education as well, because the moment that something becomes knowledge that's created as a pedagogy, what we're also coming up with a certain set of norms, a correct way to talk about it, a very sort of list by list way of bringing into education, right? And that's why I think instead of also maybe focusing so much on whether or not something should be taught, to really go back to the sphere of education and see how things should be taught, or what does it do to the space of education to be able to teach these things, and what will the outcomes of such a discourse will be, right? And I'm thinking of the Foucauldian critique of knowledge itself, where he sort of says that the idea that knowledge creates power itself is an illusion, right? Knowledge creates certain systems of propagating norms in a very close sphere, in a very categorized way, that students constantly try to break out of. So what I'm trying to say is that no matter, even if this messy fantasy is turned into pedagogy, that there is pleasure in sort of going around that pedagogy, in sort of breaking that pedagogy, in saying that, okay, no, this is what is taught, but I'm more interested in what is not taught as well.
Yeah, and a quick add on to that, I really like what you brought up, Shrija, around just like it becomes complicated in the context of education, right? And I think through the UNESCO guidelines around how to talk about sex ed in the Comprehensive Sexuality Education Handbook, for example, right? And one of the key principles is something around least harm route. And so one of the things educators are told to teach is always present young people with the method that will get them, which will cause the least harm, right? And I think that in itself is like, has many questions in my mind as an adult, right? Like, where, like, what is harm? What is harm to me might be different from what is harm to you, and what is safe for me might be different from safety to you. And so I think as I speak with adults, like a lot of times, for example, I'm like interfacing with people who are adults because this is just, sex ed is something everyone needs right now and never had growing up. I think I just encourage people to think through what that means for themselves, because one person might be like, I need to use a condom, I need to use a dental dam for every type of sexual activity. But one person's like, actually, that doesn't matter to me at all. And how that we need to create space for that being okay, and for people having the agency to be able to say that that's okay.
Yeah, thank you. Now we'll take questions from the audience. And one question which I think is interesting, it suggests that porn uses desire to expand market. Then is porn just a product of late capitalism? And anyone can go first.
Srija, this time you start.
I mean, I think that saying yes or no to that will not take us too far, right? Yes, porn is a product of late capitalism, and then what? So I'm sort of, and maybe another way to frame it would be to sort of say that, because I think we have this implication when we say that, okay, it is just a product of late capitalism, and therefore one shouldn't consume it, but doesn't really talk about what this consumption entails. Right. And again, this is what we've been saying so far also, that once it becomes the norm, and that's why also, again, that I'm wary of producing porn that is solely pleasurable, that will be comfortable, that will present all kinds of bodies, because I think that's a very utopian ideal of what it should be, and it's very difficult to attain. Not just difficult to attain, but any idea of utopia, as we know, will always leave out certain bodies, right? Even if we sort of come up with a very equal representation of what it means to have sex, it will always leave out certain other forms of presentation, certain other modes of representation, right? So I think, and that's I think what I'm picking up from the question, I'm sorry if I don't exactly answer it, this is also my tactic as a lit major, uh, is that to call it a product of late capitalism sort of does very little to sort of even critique porn, but also to sort of, in a way, come up with productions of porn that are seemingly non-capitalistic, right? And I'm wondering what that might be, and maybe I'm interested to see what the others have to say also.
I have one quick thing to add. Like, I guess my answer is so what if it is, because everything is like everything is a product we buy and consume. And performers in porn also deserve to be paid for their labor. Performers, everyone part of that production chain should be paid for their labor. And there's like research been done on this. There are wage gaps when it comes to sex, when it comes like for cis men and cis women, there is different wages. There are wage gaps when it comes to race. And I think the thing that also that comes up is like when I tell people pay for your porn, they're like, it's shocking. It's shocking to people to be like, what? Why would I pay for porn when I can get it for free? And I wish people treated it more like a product. I wish people treated it more like a Netflix subscription, because we're okay with paying for certain types of media, but not with others, which I would invite people to sit and question and think about. And so just thinking through how, if it's a product, who are the people whose pockets we are filling, right? And the answer might also just be like big Pornhub, right? Big porn, mainstream media. But yeah.
I think Shrija and Karishma have answered this wonderfully, but I had just a quick point, is that the way that question is framed, is porn a product of late capitalism? It implies a one-way sort of causality where capitalism is something which is producing porn, which I'm a little wary of being sympathetic towards that rhetoric. Instead, it might be more of like a symbiotic relationship where it goes both ways rather than one thing being a well from which porn is extracted from or produced from.
Thank you. The next question somehow takes us to what Shrija was talking about with reference to, the obscenity and its definition and the religious sort of thing you gave us. So if we think about the distinction between porn and erotica, where erotica is always thought of something which is elegant, which people consume. And porn is always that perverted, violent thing which you're not supposed to probably probe at all. So what is the validity of this distinction, one? And how do you see porn in relation to erotica?
I mean, I can go this time unprompted. I think that that's a distinction that even the pornographic field makes, right? What is deemed as, say, softcore pornography, which is like a more intimate, sort of intense, passionate kind of love making, whereas hardcore pornography is where the dirty stuff lies, right? That's not real life. That's just kink. That's just fantasy. It doesn't sort of translate into lived experience, so to say. I think that the distinction, I mean, sure, it is a boring distinction to make, but I think it's also a deeply classist distinction to make, which is to say that consumers of porn, especially hardcore pornography, are mostly, lower class men who sort of have easy access to it, who are sitting at home, sort of watching things on their phone. And therefore, these are the people who sort of go on to perpetrate sexual violence. Whereas consumers of erotica, and we are the more, it's a polished way of accessing sex, right? And it's mostly in prose. You read it in stories. You come up, you sort of watch these in magazines. It's only in films. Right, and I find that distinction, it is a very deeply classist one. But again, to say that, you know, that in the sphere of education, that erotica is fine, but maybe pornography should be kept out of it because children are also consuming it, which is also its own another boring argument to me, because children are deeply sexual beings, that they think about sex so much more than we sort of give them credit for, right? And I think what the distinction does is also sort of helps us see the ways in which we constantly want to segregate good kinds of sex from bad kinds of sex. And I'll leave it at that, yeah.
Just like a quick add-on to that, because Shrija was talking about the distinction that was made, and in relation to that, the categories themselves never hold unto themselves. There is ever never ever a empirically verifiable way to say that this is what these are the guidelines that you have to tick, and that script would be pornography, this script would be soft porn or erotica. That guideline changes so much, and it is very telling when someone tries to maintain that distinction as concrete about their own sort of I guess political motivations about what they want to prop up and what kind of status quo they are invested in.
Yeah, I think Shrija and Shreyanshu capture this beautifully, but I think the thing that it brings out for me is also to add on to Shrija's point about good sex and bad sex. I think I just think about how purity culture affects all of us, right? And how we think of any sex outside of sex between cisgender, able-bodied, upper caste, upper class people, heterosexual individuals trying to have a baby. Anyone outside of that is impure, and that leads to very real implications, which I see just like from people reaching out to me feeling deep shame. And that shame, I think, manifests in all sorts of sexual activity, whether that is with partners or even masturbation, right? And like that's a beast of itself, which we can get into if you have questions. But I think that's another thing just wanted to bring into the space.
We have time for one last quick question, but like quick comments and then we end. Even though it's a loaded question, so I would ask you to hold yourself a little, but yes. So the question goes like, how does one work with the discomfort of confronting violence in porn and education? Can this discomfort be useful? Can it prompt us to think of desire as possibly discomforting, non-affirming, etc.?
Can you repeat the last part of the question? What is the question?
So largely the question, an attendee is trying to ask us to talk about the discomfort of confronting violence in porn and education. So they're asking, can this discomfort be useful? And can it prompt us to think of desire as something possibly discomforting, non-affirming? Yes.
I can start us off with like a really basic practical example, which is just, I think it is a bold assumption to say that only what we define as violence is uncomfortable when it comes to desire. A lot of people might have lived experience with sex, which is not fun, which is uncomfortable, which is abusive, right? And the average, like the statistics show that a lot of young people have already experienced some type of abuse when they're walking into a classroom and talking about sex for the first time. And I think that this type of statement like assumes that violence is not part of a young person's life, and that, oh, if we're talking about pleasurable and safe sex, then it's totally fine and it's not going to harm anyone, right? And I think that if we are thinking about discomfort, we need to be thinking about ways to be trauma informed as educators in speaking with any person. And I'm not saying there's a perfect answer, but I think there's ways that people have tried to do that, whether that is creating norms and guidelines, creating group norms, whether that's literally having mental health practitioners to reach out to. There's ways to grapple with discomfort, regardless of whether we're talking, and need to grapple with discomfort, regardless of whether we're talking about violence. And I'm excited to hear Shira's thoughts, because you had a lot to say about this in your 10 minutes.
Yeah, no, I think I'm going to kind of repeat what I was getting at, which is that we think of the rhetoric of harm as pitted against pleasure. But what becomes maybe fundamental to pleasure is also the harm of it, right? And I think in a lot of ways, discomfort is essential to modes of education and sex alike. And I say this also because time and again, we come across, sex ed being taught as, or is a gateway to finding ways of sex that is entirely comfortable. And I think to enter the pedagogy of sex, the pedagogy of desire, with the aspiration to find comfort is a deeply unuseful one, I would say, because I think it's interesting because, we do know that desire can be messy, especially like you say in lived experience. But our discussions of it, our expectations of it always come from the point of view that it shouldn't take into trauma, or that it shouldn't sort of traumatize, that it shouldn't sort of, trouble what we believe is good sex, right? So yeah, I think to very briefly answer the question, that discomfort is always absolutely essential, especially when we talk about sex. And I'm reminded again of Ms. Andrea Long Chu, where she says that our desires are deeply undesirable, right? And we give very little credit to the fact that our fantasies don't quite align with our notions of safe sex.
Yeah, we are out of time. So if you have like one comment, you can go with that.
Okay, just very quickly to the last part of the question, and I thought the wording was so wonderful. And I think the question was, is desire non-affirming? And I'm just like borrowing this from psychoanalysis. And it's that desire is always not affirming. It ruptures our sense of self, and which is what Srija was also pointing towards, is that it always pushes us into like an uncomfortable space where our sense or our imagination of who we think we are no longer holds any sort of water, whether it's our ideas of good sex, safe sex, equality, egalitarian ideas, all of that goes into evaporates.
Yes. Thank you so much for being a part of this panel, for engaging with us and giving us such wonderful ideas. And it's time for us to move on to our next panel. So we have to bid goodbye to the three of you and welcome Saransh and Rahul Sain for our final session of the conference.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks, see you.
See you. We move on to our second panel of the day and a final session of the conference with two brilliant educators, researchers, and teachers who will be engaging us with the question, what is the pedagogy of sex education? We have with us today Rahul Sain, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of English at Tufts University. His areas of interest include psychoanalysis, queer theory, literary studies, and cinema studies. Rahul was a critical writing preceptor in the Young India Fellowship Program at Ashoka University from 2017 to 2020. Currently, he's working on a book manuscript on the pleasure points of Bombay cinema. When not writing his PhD, Rahul carelessly loses himself in the world of Meena Kumari and Rekha and is found fantasizing Ranveer Singh at odd hours. We have also with us today uh, Saransh Sugant. Saransh likes to play with avatars. They are a visual and performance artist, researcher, educator, and facilitator, and have been invested in the ideas of sustainability and climate change for the past 11 years. Their journalistic training makes them curious to constantly learn and layer their work with various disciplines, including gender and mental health. The queer stage artist in them had been aching to get under the spotlight, and so was born Avatari Devi in 2019. Aftari works at reimagining Londa Nach, a folk theatre from where men and boys perform as women. The theatre form is from their native state of Bihar. They like to flirt with Angrezi, Bhojpuri laced Hindi, and of course, men, women, and everyone in between. Some political views are more aziz, dear to them, others become fodder for some laziz, delicious humor. Before we begin, I'll quickly run down on the format once again. The speakers will speak on the post question for about 10 minutes, post which I will initiate conversation between the panelists for another 10 minutes, followed by a 30 minutes Q&A with the audience who will have submitted their questions in writing. The audience have to submit their questions in the Q&A box, which will be present on the bottom of your screen. So welcome Rahul and Saransh, and I think Saransh is going first.
चारुल जी बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद पहले तो, ठीक है ना, ठीक है। तभी भी हम हिंदी या अंग्रेजी मिक्स करके बोलेंगे। अभी हम थोड़ा सारांश जी को तो छुट्टी दे देंगे, अवतारी जी को नहीं ले आएंगे, ठीक है ना, उसी हिसाब से अपना नाम बदल देते हैं। अच्छा, ये सब कोई बहुत ज्यादा अंग्रेजी में बतिया लिया है, क्या करते हैं, थोड़ा मान किया थोड़ा सा अलग भाषा में थोड़ा समझाएं चीज, ठीक है ना। तो शुरू किया जाए ना एकदम जी, चलिए। नमस्ते सबको एकदम, ठीक है ना। राहुल जी, चारुल जी, बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद हमको यहाँ बुलाने के लिए, थैंक यू, बहुत ज़्यादा थैंक यू हमको इधर बुलाने के लिए। तो हम लोग आज क्या बतिया रहे हैं, हम लोग आज बात कर रहे हैं पेडागोजी ऑफ सेक्स। पेडागोजी ऑफ सेक्स, पढ़ाने का तरीका सेक्स का, पढ़ाने का तरीका कौन हो सकता है, चलिए उसके बारे में थोड़ा हम बतियाते हैं। अब क्या है कि पढ़ाने से पहले तो पूछना पड़ता है किसको पढ़ा रहे हैं, नहीं, जिसको पढ़ाएंगे उसी हिसाब से बात करेंगे, ठीक है। तो it always depends who am I educating. If I go to Bihar, then I'll have to speak a different language than I'm speaking in Delhi or in Punjab or in Kashmir, ठीक बात। तो यही से अभी का हम लोग क्या बोलते हैं इसको, कॉन्टेक्स्ट बहुत जरूरी होता है कि पेडागोजी कैसा हो, ठीक है। आज ही हम बतिया रहे थे, हमारे साथ पहले वो लड़का, वो लड़का, one person who used to work with us, Khalil, he's also an educator. What happened is that we were talking about Bihar, you know, what will happen if I go to Bihar. what बहुत दिलचस्प मामला है कि हमारी मम्मी जी लोग ना बहुत एकदम करारी एकदम महिला लोग हैं, ठीक है ना। उन लोग को बहुत पसंद है कि उन लोग का जो बच्चा लोग है, उन लोग कैसे क्या करेगा जिंदगी में, सब में उनका हामी होना चाहिए, ठीक है ना। सब में उनका एकदम जो चीज बोले उसी हिसाब से होना चाहिए, तो उनके लिए बहुत जरूरी है। सो वी नो मदर्स, जनरली इंडियन मदर्स obsess over sons and how they will live their life, what they want to do, all of that. And what happens to fathers? I mean, they sit quietly in a corner, ठीक है। And then after that, why do they sit in quietly in a corner, and why mothers take this role of telling what to do is also something to think about. कि पापा लोग को कुछ बोलने का मन नहीं कर रहा है, लेकिन मम्मी जी लोग वो सारा काम कर दे रही है, ठीक है। तो क्या पाठ पढ़ाना है, मम्मी जी लोग को पहले से पता है कि पापा को क्या पसंद है, उसी हिसाब से चलना चाहिए। तो ऐसा काहे हो रहा है, ये भी सोचने वाला बात है, ठीक है। तो शादी किससे होगा, शादी किस घर में होगा, किस रिलीजन में होगा, कौन सा कास्ट में होगा, विच पर्सन फ्रॉम वेयर, रिलीजन, कास्ट, एवरीथिंग। सो क्या हो रहा है उससे, वी आर डिसाइडिंग ओनली नो दैट which body will come in the house and who will my son or daughter or somebody like me can have sex with. Very important to decide that. तो ऐसा environment में जब हमारे चच्चा पप्पा सब चीज सबको तैनात रहते हैं कि लड़का कहीं बिगड़ ना जाए, चाहे लड़की कहीं बिगड़ ना जाए, ठीक है ना, that the boys and girls don't go astray, ठीक है ना. When we are worried about that, how do we educate about sex? तो इस मुद्दे पे हम थोड़ा सा जाते हैं, थोड़ा दाएं अथवा बाएं. कल आप लोग बात कर रहे थे ना पब्लिक का प्राइवेट का, पब्लिक एंड प्राइवेट. तो क्या होता है कि हम जो ये रूप लेते हैं, तारी वाला रूप, तो ये हम थिएटर में लेते हैं, ठीक है, हम परफॉर्म करते हैं, बस बोलते हैं बहुत ज्यादा. तो उसमें भोजपुरी में बतियाते हैं. आई टॉक इन भोजपुरी, इंग्लिश, हिंदी, bit of English. I try both, and then I try to speak in some mixed language. And then what happens is that then when I start performing and when I start speaking this way, I will recount one incident. Now this was in 2019. अभी खूब अच्छे से नाच गा के हम बोले. अब उसके बाद जो रिएक्शन आया वो तो आया है. दूसरे दिन हम ऐसे ही घूम रहे थे. I was just in the festival. I was just moving around, and then this boy comes up to me and he tells me, लखनऊ से लड़का आया था. लखनऊ, this boy from Lucknow tells me, हमको लगा पहली बार हमारी भाषा में हमसे कोई इस मुद्दे पे बात कर रहा है. हमको बड़ा बढ़िया लगा. तो हम तो एकदम अकबका गए कि अच्छा हम तो ऐसा, और हमको एकदम लगा कि एकदम दिल पसीज गया हमारा. लाइक माय हार्ट वाज टोटली फुल, ठीक है. कहे कि एकदम अब हम जिस भाषा में बोल रहे हैं वो बिल्कुल किसी के दिल को छू जाए, बहुत ही अच्छा लगता है. नहीं, और जबकि खासकर जब सेक्स और सेक्सुअलिटी के बारे में इतना लोग बात कर रहे हैं, तो उसके बाद कहाँ पे किससे बात कर रहे हैं. और अगर क्या होता है कि लौंडा नाच में, अब लौंडा लोग जो नाचता है ज्यादातर, जो आप पढ़ेंगे थोड़ा आर्टिकल तो पता चलेगा कि लौंडा लोग को बहुत ज्यादा बोलते हैं आप लोग क्या एकेडमिक्स में एजेंसी, बहुत ज्यादा एजेंसी नहीं होता है अपने शरीर के ऊपर. वी डांस, बट वी डांस फॉर द मेल गेज, and then what the male gaze and the male body can do to you, we don't have entire control. Okay. So when I own this, when I'm owning this body and I'm using this to perform in the way I like, I'm coming here and I'm talking whatever I want. ठीक बात. अभी तो ऐसा कुछ नहीं है कि हम कुछ बोल रहा है कि ऐसे बोलना है, ऐसे नाचना है. So the moment I do this and I can say many things which I want to, then something changes. And what changes is the boy like this who comes to me and tells me that that somebody in my language, somebody is telling me something in my language, and that shifts something. 2 months back, this was the public aspect. In the public, when I am performing. In the private sphere, when we are more intimate, when we are talking to 2-3 people. So there is this listening circle which we have been running, where these queer people, we come together. Very nice it is. A lot of kinds of people who come. So there is gay and transgender and all kinds of people. अब पेडागोजी जो होता है पढ़ाने का तरीका में, तो पढ़ाने में तो सुनना भी बहुत जरूरी है. वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट टू लिसन. तो सोचे कि सुनने का प्रैक्टिस किया जाए. अध्याय, ठीक है, तो अध्याय खुल गया था हमारा कि वी हैव टू प्रैक्टिस हाउ टू लिसन. देन but then as we started to listen, I will talk about one meeting where there were a lot of gay men. And then the gay men were talking about what kind of bodies do they love? If they are feminine, are they okay with it? If there are trans people, are they okay with it? And if they are not okay, why they are not okay? And then there was one person who was present, who used to work with trans people. He was quiet during this meeting. But what happened after that was that, we were all listening to each other. And even though I perform in this avatar, and I'm also transitioning, becoming transgender, but it becomes very important to listen. Baki main kahe ki, because There are a lot of these men who I was talking about and talking to who also don't like themselves, who hate themselves, who have misogyny, but that misogyny, औरत लोग को hate करने का जो प्रक्रिया होता है, तो उसमें they hate themselves also. Little bit they hate themselves also. Their own femininity also. They have to be masculine. They have to be super masculine. And there are some people who have been sexually harassed, assaulted, who are continue to be repressed. बाकी फिर भी सोच नहीं सकते. Still they cannot think that how it is repressing them. The comprehensive sexuality education के बारे में जो हम लोग बात करते हैं, so we talk about the teenagers and how to educate them, how to teach young adults. Baki, to go back to what I was talking in the beginning, when I was talking to Khalil, who may go to Bihar, who may go to Rajasthan to educate. What happens is that if we don't pay attention to the adults, and if the adults themselves hate themselves, are not sexually fulfilled, and they hate each other, they hate themselves, then how can we teach about sex? And who can we teach about sex? We can't. We can't. काहे कि पब्लिक ने जैसे हम गमछा पहने, ठीक है ना, ये गमछा है, ठीक है, गमछा बहुत एकदम बिहारी चीज होता है, बंगाली होता है, राहुल जी को पता होगा एकदम. It is a very common thing that we use. So he said, I thought not to use dupatta, use a gamcha. Let it be very Bihari Bengali says. Okay. The sex जो है ना ऐसे ही समाहित होना चाहिए. सेक्स की जो भाषा है वो ऐसे ही समाहित होनी चाहिए, बिल्कुल सन जानी चाहिए. आज जितने भी अडल्ट लोग हैं, कहे कि हम बच्चा लोग को तो बात कर लेंगे. If I go and talk to the younger kids about sexuality, it is okay. This route, young kids are very okay with it. 26-year-olds, 25-year-olds, 16-year-olds, they are all okay with it. Who are not okay with it? 40-year-olds, my age group only, or the next 50-year-old, the 60-year-old, they all become uncle and auntie. Then after that, nothing goes here. That is what happened. The काहे की तो pedagogy of sex के बारे में जैसे हम लोग को बतियाना है, we have to talk about it. We have to prepare the context, the environment around us to be able to talk about sex, and to be able to talk about not just sex, but about themselves, about the specific ways in which they have learned to hate themselves, and the specific ways in which they must learn or relearn to love themselves. थिएटर में कोई टर्न होता है विभत्स, एक नवरस में एक रस होता है विभत्स. डिस्गस्ट जो होता है बहुत ही इंटरेस्टिंग चीज होता है, क्योंकि अगर हम नेचर में देखें तो द मोमेंट वी आर डिसगस्टेड बाय समथिंग, देन वी मस्ट स्टे, you know, something does not smell good, you stay away from it, don't eat it. You smell the food and then you throw it, not good. But with humans in relationship, we are conditioned to hate or not hate, and we are conditioned to hate and love certain things within ourselves, and that is what we need to unlearn or relearn in the pedagogy of sex, specifically with adults, and through listening, through empathy, and then after that we go to the children, because the children will learn. The children will learn from the adults if the adults are taken care of, and the adults know how to truly love. तो यही 10 मिनट में इतना ही बोलेंगे, ज्यादा नहीं बोलेंगे, ज्यादा समय नहीं लिया ना हम. चारुल जी मुस्कुरा रही है, मतलब ठीक है मिजाज है. चलिए राहुल जी आपको दे रही हूँ.
Yes, Rahul, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Charul. I hope you can hear me. And Saransh, that was so important. I think I've been thinking a lot about this question, how to invent and develop a language of sex and pleasure all the time. So I would actually like to, okay, firstly, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on whichever time zone you are at the moment. I actually wanted to begin by thanking CSGS for inviting me to this conference, and particularly Charul for contacting me and coordinating this whole thing with me. This is in fact my first engagement with Ashoka University since I left in 2020, and it's always such a great pleasure to come back. Now, talking about pleasure, which I simply cannot stop talking about, I would like to address this question, what is the pedagogy of sex education, by breaking it down into three components, the three components that constitute this question: pedagogy, sex, and education. And I'm interested in understanding, the various ways in which these three terms come together, interact with one another, under what condition and what context, but also focus a bit more, on the moments in which they cannot come together and they fall apart from each other. So there are at least two ways in my mind to think about this phrase sex education: a minoritizing way, which implies an education about sexuality, sexual practice, preference, pleasures, etc., and a universalizing way, in which sex education implies the implicitness of the erotic in the project of education. Now, it is with this latter sense that I wanted to, this latter sense which views education as always already sexed, that I'm going to engage with further. Now, these two ways, however, are not entirely dissociated, because in ancient India, we have seen that how impulses, both these impulses of sex education, were prevalent. So if you think about the text, the Kama Sutra, which was written back in between 400 to 300 BCE, we see that it is a text which teaches about sexual positions, posturings, pleasures that one needs to master to become a pro in sex. But more importantly, it also gives us a list of 64 skills that one must acquire in order to become the most desirable and the most attractive person. And out of those 64 skills are knowledge and education. And it gives like a list: the knowledge of prosody, knowledge of poetics, knowledge of dictionaries, and it has a lot of those things. So the Kama Sutra passionately therefore argues that there is an intimate connection between knowledge and our libidinal impulses. So intelligence is sexy, knowledge is seductive, and the Kama Sutra seems to be making a case for such a theorization. Now, it is, however, not only in ancient India that seemed to suggest that knowledge has a libidinal basis. In fact, Madhavi has written about this in her book, A History of Desire in India, that, and I'm quoting from her text, there is something about education itself anywhere that depends on desire, unquote. The ancient Greeks acknowledged this all too well. So in Plato's Symposium, Socrates is this great Greek philosopher and teacher, and he's presented as a supremely wise and knowledgeable man around whom sexy young boys are always fluttering like butterflies in the hope of learning something. These boys desire Socrates' intellect just as much as they desire his body. Socrates is this kind of a sugar daddy every twink wants to fuck or gets fucked by. So in the symposium, which is a drinking party, Agathon, who is one of the invitees, kind of say this, and I'm just going to read a bit from the text to tell you what exactly Plato means by this erotic in education. Quote from the text: Agathon, who happened to be lying on his own on the bottom couch, said, "Come and lie down beside me, Socrates, so that by contact with you, I can share the piece of wisdom that came to you in the porch." Socrates sat down and said, "How splendid it would be, Agathon, if wisdom was the sort of thing that could flow from the fuller to the emptier of us when we touch each other, like water which flows through a piece of wool from a fuller cup to an emptier one. If wisdom is really like that, I regard it a great privilege to share your couch," unquote. Now, it is important to know that in Plato's world, the transaction of knowledge or wisdom is inextricably tied to the transaction of desire and sex. So Plato proposes a model of an erotic educational relationship where wisdom and knowledge flows from an older person who is much more knowledgeable to a younger person who is thirsty and lusty for knowledge. However, we are no longer living in the moral or immoral universe of the Kama Sutra or Plato, where learning takes place in the proximity of desire. Neither do we occupy the politically incorrect and seedy fantasy world of Farah Khan's Mehuna, where a chemistry teacher let the pallu of a sari sensuously fall on the face of a student, who then in turn flirts with her, seduces her, and sings for her. nor the erotic cosmos of Karan Johar's Student of the Year, where intimacy between two male students is made to thrive and flourish under various educational and co-curricular pretexts, although couched in heterosexual terms. Rather, we have come to occupy a politically correct, woke, and sexually paranoid and morally conservative climate, where the earlier thrills of sexuality education, often recognizable through terms like risk, transgression, we've been talking about this yesterday, both Vikram and Shoptoshi referred to it, are now sought to be replaced by a more safe, secure, sanitized classroom. And we see this everywhere around us. And the casualness with which the phrase safe space is thrown around this is kind of just baffling. My reason to invoke these two popular Bollywood films at par with the Kama Sutra and Plato Symposium is to point finger to the way in which sex or eros is presented with comedy, humor, irony, and playfulness. But comedy and irony do not sit too well in the contemporary intellectual climate. Instead, certainty is what that sells. Singularity sells. Absolute truth sells. So if we know anything about sexuality or desire, we'll know that these are the very things that desire and sexuality militate against. However, we must not be wrong in thinking that the desire for a safe, sanitized, and antiseptic classroom has been fired by contemporary woke imagination and activism. Many, many years ago, when the Indian independence movement was at its peak, and 3 years before Mahatma Gandhi would call the civil disobedience movement, Pandey Bechan Sharma from Uttar Pradesh published a collection of short stories called Chocolate, in which he drew attention to the rampant homosexual culture that was prevalent among young boys who went to these colonial schools during this time. And the titular story from that collection kind of reports this moral degradation of students under the impact of colonial education in these words. I'm just going to read out just 2 sentences from it. Quote, "There are all kinds of places in this country where boys can get ruined. Most of the efforts to mislead boys occur at boarding schools, brahmacharya ashrams, company gardens, fairs, and festivals. One often hears of teachers being responsible for boys' ruin. There are few schools where 5 to 10 such cases do not come before the headmaster each year. Despite this, people do not think of reform. There are few students who do not have a handsome friend. Students say their beautiful friends are just friends or are relatives, but it is impossible to describe how they behave with these friends or relatives," unquote. So squarely, the accusation of spreading homosexuality falls on teachers, and the locale for this moral degeneration of students is boarding schools and ashrams. So modern education's corruptible influence on sexuality is therefore the bone of contention here. And I would not take much time, but I would also kind of at this moment draw, or rather try to draw a analogy between education and sexuality. And one of the things in which the two mirror each other, as Srija was talking about this just a few minutes back, that there is something about education that is displacing. That we enter the classroom, we learn, we unlearn, we relearn. We are not intellectually safe, secure, and consolidated in one place. And I think the space of the classroom is one such space where a lot of these movements actually happen or can happen. Sexuality, very interestingly, kind of mirrored that. So sexuality is one such register, one such space which does not come with guarantee, which does not come with certainty. We do not know, or rather we cannot predict desire. We cannot tell that this is a person I would desire. This is a person I would not desire. Desire is something that is fired by some kind of unknowingness. And that element, that kind of commonality between education and sexuality is what very strongly being foregrounded in Pandey Bechan Sharma's story, or the kind of accusation that education is what corrupts, because there is oftentimes accusation against sexuality as well. The sexuality is what corrupts. So I would like to conclude by introducing a caveat in this question, what is the pedagogy of sex education, by turning to Lee Edelman's work on queerness and education. And in his recent book, Bad Education, which is coming out later this year, which draws its title from Pedro Almodovar's film Bad Education, which is a film I would highly recommend everyone to watch, because it has a lot to offer on this twinning of education and sexuality and change and a lot of those things. So Lee argues that education itself is a conservative project and a heteronormative enterprise. And it is a slightly complicated argument. I'm going to try to break it down for you quickly. He says that so long as education is aimed at the social reproduction of subjects, often with the figure of the child at its center, education is invested in the production of a morally good citizen. So think about what Shoptoshi was talking yesterday, Fatima's action with her children, and the judge saying that she's free to educate her child in whatever way they want. But this particular method that Fatima is adopting is bad education because it is indecent, it is immoral, and all of those things. So education, therefore, is always aimed at producing a subject, producing a particular body, which is moral, which is supposed to be morally good, which is supposed to contribute in some meaningful ways in society. So all education is therefore heteronormative, because be it the morally conservative version that seeks to keep conversations about sex, sexuality, desire away from it, or the kind of education that those of us who like to think of ourselves on the other side, to be on the other side of the spectrum of moral conservativeness, we believe in. So where we believe that the right to sexuality education is aimed at producing sensible and sensitized subjects. So both these versions, therefore, are committed to the production of good citizens, good subjects in relation to sexuality and education. What do we do then? How do we account for the fact that education itself is a version of reproductive heteronormativity? Because it is reproducing, not biologically, but socially. It's ideologically reproducing, socially reproducing, politically reproducing, and yet fight against the moral conservativeness that seeks to take away sex and sexuality from the purview of education. And that is the challenge that I'm willing to take on. That is the challenge which I think is most politically compelling at the moment, where we need to not necessarily locate liberation and freedom in sexuality, but at the same time, kind of grapple with the fact that this is one area, and as Saransh was also pointing out, that we do not have an adequate language to talk about pleasure and to talk about sexuality. And how do we therefore develop that language? So that is the double bind, that is the tension that I'm willing to engage with and that I'm willing to address head on. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. Those are such wonderful set of comments. I have so many questions. I don't know where to start from, but just because it's ended with thinking of education as a sort of a repressive mode, something just used for reproduction. But then at the same time, I would like to ask both of you, because we were just talking about fantasy in the previous panel, is there also something phantasmatic about education or sex education? Does education also have this quality of fantasy and phantasmaticness? So either of you can go first.
Rahul, do you want to? Please.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's actually a very interesting question. And that's actually a very broad question in the sense that, yes, there is obviously fantasy in education as much as there is fantasy in so many, or in almost all aspects of our life. But then what is very compelling to me and interesting to me to think about is that what is that fantasy that I'm attaching to the question of education? And here I think it is important to make a distinction between education and learning, because I think that when we think about education, we think about it in a more institutionalized way, institutionalized sense, where education kind of leads on to something. Education kind of, there are certain parameters that we need to meet to prove to the world that we are educated. So I'm interested in the question that what fantasy does, and what is the fantasy that we are thinking about in terms of education? That is it a fantasy that I was referring to about producing a morally good subject, morally good citizen, or is it a fantasy which kind of pushes me or pushes my intellectual frontiers, kind of makes me come to terms with my own desires and oftentimes kind of reveal the fact that I probably do not know my desires, and I'm okay with that, and I'm okay with not knowing, and I'm okay with that uncertainty. So I think one can take the question of fantasy in so many directions and think about that. What exactly does it serve politically?
Thank you, Saransh.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Ram, for that. तो इस सवाल को हम उसी बिल्कुल स्पेसिफिक तरीके से लेंगे. Even as children, when we learned some things, we used that in very fantastic ways, right? And the younger the child, there's an example which is often used that, if you give, when you give a safety pin or a set of safety pins to absolutely young children who are, say, in kindergarten, then the way they would use it would be, there could be thousands of ways in which they would use it. And then as children get educated and then they arrive at a certain age, and then you ask them to use the same safety pin in certain ways, there'll be very limited ways of usage. So if we mean fantasy and the usage of imagination, and if education is encouraging us to use our imagination in different ways, then we have to ask ourselves that to what extent is our education enabling us and empowering us to imagine, or is it as you said, Rahul, earlier, that, or is there also a very narrow agenda which it is pushing us towards, and is it always about reproduction of the a citizen in a certain mold, or a worker, or a worker who would fit the mold in this in the capitalist world that we live in. So if those are the agendas of education, and we have to be very wary of that too. There's this essay by Charles Tilly, I think I'm getting the name right, who talks about how all states are gangster states, and basically that bullying is their primary thing. And it becomes very important to look at that right now in the face of the rising authoritarianism that we're seeing all across the world. And hence, education will also get affected by the agenda of the many strong men who are rising. So then, where does that? So what specific direction often that even our imagination is being guided into? And as we know, there is a very specific direction that our imagination and fantasies are being guided into through popular media, through education, through all sources of education, as we know. So I think we have to be we have to handle this fantasy a little slightly carefully.
Yeah, and this makes me think that then is there sort of a universal mode of sex education? Because you did talk about context in the beginning. It's very important to set the context, but also is there then a universal context of how we are thinking about sex education, or would that be what Rahul referred to as bad education?
I would say even if there is bad education, अगर चलिए बहुत खराब हो गया, सब चीज रायता फैला दिए अच्छे से, ठीक है ना, तो उसके बाद भी मतलब कि अब बचेगा क्या, ये तो देखना पड़ेगा ना, अब छोड़ तो नहीं सकते, ठीक है ना. अब अगर 100 लोग गाली दे रहे हैं हमको कि बिहारी हैं, बिहार से हैं, ये तो चलिए हैं बिहारी, ठीक है ना. अब उसके बाद क्या, अब उसके बाद फिर उसको किस तरह से पेश करें, किस तरह से हम उसके साथ अपने ही कॉन्टेक्स्ट को कैसे बनाएं, कैसे सवारे, कैसे रखें, वो तो हमारी जिम्मेदारी हो जाएगी, ठीक है ना. वो जिम्मेदारी तो नहीं छोड़ सकते. So we can never leave this. We can never, however the context is, we have to understand and engage with the context on its own terms. Because even if I want to, people won't become woke. People will not respect me in this form if I walk out of this room and just walk into this lane. It will not naturally happen. But then I will have to engage with it. and I'll have to engage it with the hate, and with how that hate is also turning towards the person who's throwing it at me. In Buddhism, there's this concept of interbeing, that everything exists in relationship with everything else, and the self that we talk about, the self-expression that we talk about, that also is made of non-self components. And until and unless we don't, and the context could be, very hateful, or could be very enabling, but myself is constructed of both these things, and I must understand, pay attention to in what ways, and then engage with the context after that.
Rahul.
I was actually kind of thinking something that Saransh mentioned, that the question, the idea of the self being undone, or the idea of the self being questioned. And I was thinking that so much of that has to do with the nature of our desires itself, or themselves, because desire particularly is one of those spaces where we are not allowed to be ourselves. And what I mean is that, again, to use a word that Saransh used, that we lose a lot of our agency. As much as the fantasy of agency is there, as much as would like to hold on to the question of agency, we think that, this is what I desire, but so much of our desires are desires of the other. And I'll just give a quick example here. Let's say you fall in love with somebody. That person's desires start becoming your desire. So you start wearing a lot of blue because this person likes blue. You start acquiring a taste in jazz because this person is a whatever jazz fan. So you transform a lot of it. This Charul is aware of it. I take this reference a lot in class, that Amir Khusro has this very famous qawwali for Nizamuddin, which begins with this line that "Chhap tilak sab chheen li mujhse naina milaike," which means that the moment I look at you, I start losing all the markers of my identity. I become more of you. And I feel that then becomes, or rather that then informs the question of education, that if sex and sexuality itself is undoing the self, undoing ourselves, then how can we map that onto the project of education, which is supposed to teach with certainty and guarantee? And therefore, to me, that phrase sex education or sexuality education kind of undoes itself, where sex is continuously pulling us away from ourselves, from whatever the subject of our desires. And on the other hand, education is kind of pushing us towards saying that this is what you need to do, this is what you need to aspire towards, this is what you desire, any of those frameworks. So the two things are kind of pulling them away from each other. And therefore, that is the tension that I was referring to towards the end of my presentation.
Yeah, and now we go to the questions which have been presented by the audience, and something which we have talked about previously, but the attendee wants to know that the current pedagogy of sex education insists a lot on identities and labels. Is this form of teaching useful?
Saransh, would you take that?
So my question would be, what other form would be useful? If we have to begin education, we have to begin somewhere. So, and because, identities and labels are guidances. They're guidances that in a society where there are so many, where जहाँ पे हम बोल रहे थे कि पहले कि हमारी मम्मी जी तो हैं, तो डिसाइड करना चाहते कि पहले तो जब हम बताए भी कि हम कि पहले जब हम बहुत पहले उनको बोले थे कि हम गे, ठीक है ना, उनका पहले सवाल था कि तुम लड़का बनते हो कि लड़की बनते हो, ठीक है ना, क्योंकि उनके पास वही भाषा है समझने की, ठीक है। तो जब लोगों के पास जो भाषा है उसमें केवल आप लड़का होकर एक लड़की से शादी कर सकते हैं, लड़की होकर लड़के से शादी कर सकते हैं। तो आपको उस भाषा को एक्सपैंड करने के लिए आइडेंटिटी से और भी रास्ते बनाने पड़ेंगे, और आइडेंटिटी आपको गाइडेंसेस देते हैं कि अच्छा अब ये दो आपके पास थे, अब बीच में 4-5 और भी हैं, ठीक है, अब अच्छा अब 10 और भी हैं। लेकिन जब ये स्पेक्ट्रम जो है आइडेंटिटी और लेबल्स के जरिए आप इस स्पेक्ट्रम को, यू एक्सपैंडिंग द स्पेक्ट्रम फर्दर, and as soon as you expand this spectrum, you are able to place yourself at more junctures than one. You're able to see the world in more ways than one. And I think it is आइडेंटिटी और लेबल को इतना हम ठोस ना देखें, गाइडेंसेस की तरह देखें कि हाँ ऐसा भी हो सकता है और वैसा भी हो सकता है, तो फिर थोड़ा हेल्पफुल रहेगा। वो हेल्पफुल रहेगा ये समझने के लिए कि व्हाट इज द एक्ट दैट डिफाइंस दैट आइडेंटिटी, and if we and if that act defines more than one identity, like the way um, pansexuality and bisexuality can have overlaps. They can have overlaps within themselves. So to understand that identities can have overlaps and they are not so concrete as only, जैसे मेरी मम्मी जी पूछ रही थी हमसे कि लड़का बनते हो कि लड़की बनते हो, बता दो साफ साफ। तो फिर तो मतलब कि तो फिर उतना ठोस नहीं है, सब कुछ इधर उधर जा सकता है। हम यही बोलेंगे ठीक है, बुरा नहीं है, उसको गाइडेंसेस की तरह लें और उसमें एक्ट को ढूंढें जो आइडेंटिटी की तरफ जाता है।
Yeah, I would kind of extend what Saransh pointed out by just adding like a tiny thing. I think even when we think about identities and labels, we need to understand that these identities and labels are also not quite universally true for everybody. So if I identify as gay, my imagination of the gay identity is very different from another person and how they would imagine the gay identity to be. You just need to log into Grindr and see the different kind of gays that are there. So everyone would perhaps identify as gay, but their way of identification and the attachment and value they would put to that identity is very different. Which is actually to say that it is kind of a necessary evil in the sense that we need that, as Saransh was also pointing out. But I think we need to simultaneously have an awareness about the fact that it is at the end of the day an identity and label. We need it to extract so many benefits from the state, from institutions and stuff like that. But also we need to have that awareness that, well, this is a label that I'm claiming for myself. This is an identity that I can play around with. And there is no universal truth to that identity and label.
Okay, this is a very interesting question, and I think we can talk a lot about it. But what the attendee is trying to ask us is that Saransh probably talked about somewhere in their talk that disgust is an important way to think about sex, is an important element to think about sex. So do we think of disgust and sex in opposition to each other, or is there a convergence between both of them?
That is, yeah. जैसे चारुल जी ने बोला, मतलब कि दिन रात बात कर सकते हैं इसके ऊपर.
Yeah.
So very interesting question. Disgust and what is desirable. Disgust and desirable. And there is the very simple example, and I'll use it, that there are things that we don't think are possible for a lot of us before we fall in love with a certain person. There are a lot of things which we would be disgusted by in sexual acts, which may seem like, oh my God, आप ये कैसे कर सकते हैं? Oh my God, how can you do this or that or whatever? But with love, that disgust over time can also wash away. and then you may do things which you found disgusting at a certain point of time. But then there are I mean, I'm referring to what love can enable in a relationship. But the thing is that there are, of course, different other relationships with disgust that we have. The one which I was referring to earlier, which is that that when a society teaches me to hate me in this way as a child, then it takes me 35 years to be able to come to this, because then for the rest of the time you're just wondering that I am disgusted by what I see in the mirror or what I even imagine in the mirror. Okay. And which is the part which I feel which sex education with adults in non-formal spaces, informal spaces can address, because sadly there is no formal way of addressing this, or no formal system of education which is currently going to address this. So then this thing, that the specific ways in which we are taught to hate ourselves, be disgusted with ourselves, is what love towards ourselves can help us and make us feel sexy about things that we thought were disgusting at a point of time. But yeah, Rahul, over to you.
No, I mean, I kind of agree with everything that you were saying, especially about this whole idea of looking at the mirror and basically, having a perception of oneself. And I'm kind of come from a tradition of psychoanalytic thinking, and one of the examples, kind of a very hilarious example, I find that Freud gives in the question about desire and disgust, is that when we kiss somebody, and kissing is a very intimate, passionate, sexy kind of a act, right? When we kiss somebody, we might, be very passionate. It's like, let's try French kiss today and roll our tongue into each other's mouth. But we might be very disgusted to use that person's toothbrush the next morning. And that is the way in which desire and disgust comes together, in the sense that we do not or cannot extricate one from the other very clearly. Oftentimes, one inform the other in so many ways. So, if we were talking about fantasies a while back, if you think about the kind of fantasies people nurture in relation to their sexuality and desire, there are so many things that might seem disgusting to, or rather in a particular context. But within that space of an intimate moment, those acts turn out to be very sexy and very interesting. So people might have, scat fantasy. People might have, fantasy like, all different kind of things, golden shower, piss, and everything. Now, these are, in other contexts, the same person might find that disgusting. But in that particular context, in that space of sex and desire, those are the very things that might seem titillating and exciting. So we cannot really extricate so much of desire and disgust from each other. We know that, I think our responses to those will be very situational. That in this particular situation, I'm thinking of this particular thing as disgusting or desirable. That might change in another context. So yeah.
Interesting. And so is sort of the next question. Gatendi asked that, can love or loving be taught? This is to say that this makes me think all these Bollywood movies we watch, and somehow you just know loving. Does like a pedagogy of sex education or imagination of sex education incorporate that?
I mean, comprehensive sexuality education, very specifically, it talks about building relationships and as a life skill and how to carry them out, especially for young adults. But then not just young adults, all adults need this lesson. And because I mean, it is so easy to hate, and we are seeing this in the current context. It is so easy to just drum it up, and it begs the question कि इतना हेट क्यों भाई, कहाँ से आ गया, मतलब पैदा कहाँ से हो गया इतना सारा, मतलब कि कहाँ, मतलब कि मिडवाइफरी किसने की इसकी, वो भी तो सवाल है ना, तो वो भी तो पूछना चाहिए। तो फिर उसके बाद फिर नहीं तो उसी तरह से जैसे कि हेट करना सीख सकते हैं, सिखाया जा सकता है, वैसे ही प्रेम करना भी सिखाया जा सकता है, सीख सकते हैं। If we look at the larger pedagogy, if what our society was after any nation building, what we are taught, through larger media, through school, through curriculum, we're all one. मतलब कि क्या अनेकता में एकता कैसे बने रहें, so those are ways of educating to love, a larger kind of love. Okay, and this larger kind of love enables the other smaller kinds of love. That this diversity can, if it can exist together at a larger level, then the imagination, Charul, that you're talking about, the fantasy that education can encourage, then it also encourages that at a smaller level, that even if my family thinks in a very caste specific way, that maybe because my country is liberal, maybe because it thinks in a certain way, maybe because constitution gives us those rights, we can think in other ways, and my fantasy of love can go in other directions, and it could. And which is where our education of love at a larger level can be. But yeah, when we talk about intimacy, any kind of intimacy, and which is why पहले जब हम बात कर रहे थे, बतिया रहे थे, तो हम ये शब्द बोले कि एम्पैथी और लिसनिंग क्या है? मतलब कि प्यार करने का तरीका ही है ना, मतलब कि आप प्यार की तरफ कैसे बढ़ेंगे, इसका पहला कदम है कि आप सुन पाए। पहले सुनेंगे, तब तो समझेंगे, फिर तो प्यार करेंगे ना। सुनेंगे नहीं तो कहाँ से प्यार करना सीखना, ठीक है? तो यही है, हमें तो इतना ही बस करना है, ठीक है, चलिए।
I mean, I think I don't know. I don't really have a definite answer to this question. It's a very hard question. All that I would say is that I don't know if there can be a one-size universal fit education that can teach people about loving, because I think all of us come to love with our individual history and baggages. And oftentimes the pattern that we exhibit about loving as an adult is oftentimes just an enactment of the way we have known love to be, the way we have kind of, we have been loved. Because one of the very interesting things somebody once said to me is that, as a child, all our emotions are very spontaneous. So when a baby is hungry, a baby will cry. The baby knows how to do it. When a baby is feeling, is not pleased with anything, they'll just remove it from their mouth or whatever, if the baby is being force-fed. But loving is the only thing that the baby learns or acquires by experiencing, feeling, seeing around them. And therefore, that is what gets reflected at a much later stage about attachment, about fantasy, about everything. So I think it's quite individual in that way. And I think the question was, can there be an education about loving? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that question. But what I have an answer to is that I feel there is a way in which one can come or recognize patterns of their desires. That if this is what I'm desiring, if I'm falling in love with a particular person, what exactly is this person fulfilling for me? What exactly does this person's love stand for me? My psychoanalyst is to say this absolutely fabulously, is that when somebody leaves you, when a love is lost from your life, ask yourself that what was this person fulfilling for you? And then try to see if you can get that desire fulfilled from somewhere else. And that kind of tells me that there is a pattern in which we love, and one can recognize that pattern and think about the various ways in which this question was framed, right? That can there be a universal way of teaching love? Not universal, but I think there is definitely these micro ways in which we can think about love and our own engagements with love.
Okay, we have time for one quick last question. And I'll take like 30 seconds of your time here. And this is also something which both of you did mention, and which is about political correctness. So, is there any role of political correctness in a classroom? Or is it something to be completely shunned away, kept in a box, and not to be opened again? Yes.
Rahul, bole.
Okay. I don't know what it means to be politically correct, but I know that a classroom has to be an enabling space and not a safe space, which means that we should be allowed to take risks in classroom, talk about things that are discomforting, talk about things that are taboo, engaging with it. And in fact, today morning, Saransh was telling me that in order to address a phobia, that phobia needs to be out there. And I think that can happen in the space of a classroom. So I don't know if it's a politically correct or not, but a classroom needs to be that, where we address all kinds of questions and concerns and topics, no matter how dangerous, how risky, how tabooed they are, with some amount of comfort. And if we are uncomfortable discussing that, then we must develop a language in which we are more comfortable with our discomfort and not shun the baby with the bathwater. And therefore, that will be my position, that a classroom needs to be that, and we need to fight and labor towards establishing such a classroom where nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, should be shy about vocalizing anything. And if that person is vocalizing something that is problematic, that needs discussion, then that person should be comfortable in, or rather with their discomfort, or with whatever position they're taking. That's just my take.
Yeah, पूरी तरह से हम अग्री करते हैं आपके साथ क्या कि जो हेट करने वाला जो बात बोल रहे थे ना, so it is so I'll go back to the example which I was talking about earlier. So in the group where they were gay men and they were talking about certain things that they find attractive, somebody perceived this is transphobia. Okay, then they just left in huff and puff, this is transphobic, I'm leaving. And then they wrote to me that how you're encouraging this environment and all of that. Like, hey, which is what I was telling Rahul, that if I don't give the space to be wrong, how do I give the space to go towards the right? Like, and that has to be an enabling space. I mean, ये सब कोई हम लोग पहले सीख के तो पैदा हुए नहीं. All the love and all the hate we have learned here. So this is where we will unpack it as well. And whether in the classroom or outside the classroom, we have to have the ability to create a safer space where we can talk about it with playing the boundaries of political correctness for sure. Because if we are just being politically correct, then we will never go in troubled waters. And we will shun everything. We will put some carpet over everything. उसके नीचे चलता जाएगा, carpet के नीचे बस घुसाते जाएंगे गंदगी को. And then of course we saw what happened when you do that. So I don't need to say much more than that.
Thank you both of you. I am enthralled, I'm fascinated and amused by your ideas, by the way you shared your ideas. I'm smitten. And I'm sure it has been a very fruitful evening for everyone attending this. But I just would like to thank everyone who has been a part of the panel yesterday and today for using this space to unravel such nuanced contentions, conversation, and debates on sexuality. I would also like to thank the audience who were with us till the end for their questions. And I would like to assure you that this is just a beginning of a very exciting journey that CSGS is taking towards disseminating information on sex, sexuality, and education. Thank you all, and bye-bye.